In 1887, the unforgiving frontier of New Mexico Territory witnessed something that would shake even the hardest souls, a young woman paralyzed from birth, abandoned by her own blood, to die under the merciless sun. While an entire town turned their backs, one carpenter made a choice that would defy everything the Wild West stood for. This is the story of Lydia Cross and Ethan Cole, a tale of survival, redemption, and love forged in the crucible of America's most brutal frontier. Stay with me until the end of this incredible journey, and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels across our great nation. The morning sun painted the New Mexico sky blood orange when they left her there 3 miles outside the settlement of Copper Ridge. Lydia Cross lay motionless in the dirt, her withered legs twisted beneath a torn calico dress, watching the dust cloud of her family's wagon disappear into the shimmering heat. The silence that followed was deafening. No creak of wheels, no clop of hooves, just the whisper of desert wind through the sagebrush and the distant cry of a circling hawk. 22 years of life, and it had come to this. The burlap sack beside her contained maybe 3 days' worth of oats already scattered by the morning breeze. The water jug, knocked over in their haste to be rid of her, leaked its precious contents into the thirsty earth. Her father's final words echoed in her mind. "The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. We done our Christian duty long enough." Christian duty. The phrase tasted bitter as alkali water. Lydia had been born different in a world that demanded conformity. While other children ran through prairie grass and climbed cottonwood trees, she watched from windows, her legs as useless as broken fence posts. Her mother had called it God's will. Her father had called it God's punishment. The traveling preacher who'd passed through last spring had called it a test of the family's faith. Now, apparently, they'd failed that test. The sun climbed higher, and with it came the heat, that bone-dry, soul-stealing heat that turned the Southwest into nature's own furnace. Lydia's lips cracked within the first hour. Her tongue felt like sandpaper by the second. She'd rationed the remaining water in the jug's shallow bottom, but even that was gone before noon. The town of Copper Ridge sprawled in the distance like a mirage, its adobe buildings wavering in the heat shimmer. Close enough to see far enough to be unreachable for someone who couldn't walk. It might as well have been on the moon. She'd heard stories of people abandoned on the frontier, usually criminals or those who'd crossed the wrong cattle baron. But she'd never heard of a family abandoning their own blood simply because that blood came in an inconvenient package. Yet here she was, proof that even the bonds of kinship could snap under the weight of hardship and prejudice. The first passerby came around 2 in the afternoon. A Mexican vaquero on a paint horse heading toward town with a string of pack mules. Lydia called out, her voice already hoarse from thirst. Ayúdame, please help. The vaquero slowed, his dark eyes taking in the scene, the scattered oats, the empty jug, the woman who clearly couldn't stand. For a moment, hope flickered in Lydia's chest. But then his face hardened with something that might have been pity or might have been disgust. He spurred his horse forward without another glance. "Por favor!" Lydia screamed after him, but he didn't turn back. By evening, she'd been passed by 6 more travelers, a supply wagon heading to Copper Ridge, 2 cowboys driving a small herd of cattle, a family in a covered wagon with children peering out from under the canvas, a circuit judge with his clerk, a pair of buffalo soldiers on patrol. Each one saw her, each one kept riding. The pattern was always the same: slow down, assess, realize what they were looking at, then continue on as if she were just another piece of frontier debris. Apparently, the sight of a helpless woman was less compelling than whatever business awaited them in town. As darkness fell, Lydia understood with crystal clarity that she was going to die here. The desert night would bring cold that could freeze a person's blood, followed by another day of killing heat. Without water, she had maybe 2 days left. Without shelter, maybe less. She'd always wondered what her last thoughts would be. Would she think of her family, of the life she'd never lived, of the children she'd never have, or the love she'd never know? Instead, she found herself thinking about the carpenter in town, Ethan Cole. She'd seen him exactly once 3 weeks ago when her father had driven their wagon to Copper Ridge for supplies. While her family conducted their business, Lydia had waited in the wagon bed as always. But from her vantage point, she could see into the workshop where Cole worked. He was a tall man, lean but strong, with dark hair that caught copper highlights in the afternoon sun. His hands moved with quiet precision as he shaped wood, each cut deliberate and sure. There was something about the way he worked, completely absorbed, almost reverent, that spoke of a man who found peace in creation rather than destruction. She'd watched him for maybe 10 minutes before her family returned. But in that brief time, she'd noticed something else. He worked alone. Not just physically alone, but essentially alone. There was a quality of solitude about him that she recognized the way one exile recognizes another. Now, as she lay dying in the desert, she found herself wishing she'd had the courage to call out to him that day. Not for rescue, she'd learned not to expect that from anyone, but just to acknowledge one's solitary soul to another. To say, "I see you, and I understand." The stars came out in their millions, a canopy of silver fire that made the earth seem even more vast and empty by comparison. Coyotes began their evening song, and somewhere in the darkness, she heard the hunting cry of an owl. The desert was coming alive with creatures that thrived in darkness, while she lay there growing weaker with each passing hour. Lydia closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's voice from before bitterness had claimed it. There had been a time when Lydia was very small, when her mother would sing lullabies and tell stories of princesses who overcame great trials through courage and kindness. Those stories had seemed like lies for so long that she'd forgotten they'd once brought comfort. But now, facing eternity, she found herself hoping they might be true somewhere in some world kinder than this one. The second day brought a torment that redefined her understanding of suffering. The sun seemed personal in its assault, beating down with malicious intensity. Her skin burned despite the shelter of her bonnet. Her lips split and bled. Her throat felt like raw leather. Hallucinations began by mid-morning. She saw her mother approaching with a cool pitcher of water, only to dissolve into heat shimmer. She saw children playing in impossible green meadows. She saw Ethan Cole walking toward her with steady, purposeful strides, but that too proved to be desert phantoms. More travelers passed. A mail rider, a prospector with 2 loaded burros, a well-dressed woman in a buggy who actually stopped long enough to stare before driving on with unseemly haste. Each refusal to help felt like another nail in her coffin. But Lydia had moved beyond anger into a kind of crystalline acceptance. This was how it was going to end. Not with the dramatic final scene she might have imagined, but with slow dissolution under an indifferent sky. The third morning arrived with cruel beauty. The sunrise painted the mountains in shades of rose and gold that took her breath away, what little breath she had left. She could no longer call out to passers-by. Her voice had become a whisper, then nothing at all. She was drifting in and out of consciousness when she heard the steady clip-clop of hooves and the creak of wagon wheels. Another traveler, another opportunity for disappointment. She didn't bother opening her eyes, but the sound stopped, directly in front of her. "Jesus Christ," a man's voice said, quiet but clear. There was something different in his tone, not pity, not disgust, but a kind of stunned recognition, as if he was seeing not a problem to be avoided, but a person in desperate need. Lydia forced her eyes open. The figure standing over her was backlit by the morning sun, but she could make out broad shoulders and a worn hat. When he knelt beside her, blocking the glare, She saw a face marked by sun and work with eyes the color of winter sky. Eyes she recognized. Ethan Cole. "Ma'am." His voice was careful, as if he were afraid she might break at the sound. "Can you hear me?" She tried to speak, managed only a croak that sounded barely human. Without hesitation, he reached for a canteen at his belt and cradled her head with his free hand. "Easy now. Just a little at first." The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was the most blessed thing she'd ever experienced. It trickled down her throat, like liquid salvation, bringing her back from the very edge of the void. "Not too much too fast," he murmured, pulling the canteen away when she would have drained it. "I know you're thirsty, but we need to be careful." He studied her face with those pale eyes, taking inventory of her condition with the same methodical attention he'd given his woodwork. Then his gaze traveled to her legs, to the unnatural way they lay, and she saw understanding dawn. "How long have you been here?" 3 days, she whispered, her voice like wind through dry grass. His jaw tightened. "Who left you?" "Family." The word came out broken, admitting a truth that still had the power to wound. For a long moment, he said nothing. She watched expressions chase across his features, anger, disbelief, something that might have been recognition. When he spoke again, his voice was steady but hard. "That's going to change." He stood and walked back to his wagon, returning with a thick woolen blanket. With gentle efficiency, he wrapped it around her shoulders, then slid his arms beneath her knees and back. As he lifted her from the ground, she caught the scent of sawdust and clean sweat, the honest smell of honest work. "I'm Ethan," he said as he carried her toward his wagon. "Ethan Cole." "Lydia Cross," she managed. "Well, Miss Cross, I think you've spent enough time in the desert." The wagon bed had been fitted with rough but functional cushions and a canvas cover to provide shade. He settled her there with the same care he might have shown a piece of valuable cargo, making sure she was comfortable before taking up the reins. As the wagon began to move, Lydia felt something she hadn't experienced in years: safety. Not the tentative, conditional safety of being tolerated, but the solid, unshakable safety of being protected by someone who'd made a conscious choice to care. She didn't understand why he'd stopped when so many others hadn't. She didn't understand what he intended to do with her once they reached town. But for the first time in 3 days, she wasn't thinking about dying. The ride to Copper Ridge took 40 minutes that felt like a passage between worlds. Behind them lay the desert, and everything it represented: abandonment, desperation, the casual cruelty of those who saw suffering as someone else's problem. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also possibility. Ethan didn't try to make conversation during the journey, seeming to understand that she needed time to absorb the simple miracle of rescue. Instead, he drove with steady concentration, occasionally glancing back to check on her condition. When they reached the outskirts of town, Lydia felt her anxiety spike. Copper Ridge was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and her family's abandonment would be common knowledge by now. She'd be the subject of whispered conversations and meaningful looks. Some would pity her. Others would judge her as cursed or contaminated. Most would simply wish she'd disappear again. But Ethan didn't drive toward the town center or the boarding house where she might logically be taken. Instead, he turned down a side street that led to a modest adobe house set apart from the others. A workshop stood beside it, its doors open to reveal workbenches and tools and the skeleton frames of furniture in progress. His home. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This man, this stranger, wasn't taking her to the proper authorities or the local church. He was taking her to his own home. The implications were staggering and terrifying and wonderful all at once. He brought the wagon to a stop in front of the workshop and climbed down, then came around to help her. As he lifted her from the wagon bed, she caught sight of a face peering from a window across the street. Then another. Within minutes, she knew the entire town would know that Ethan Cole had brought home the woman her own family had thrown away. "People are watching," she whispered. "Let them watch," he replied, carrying her toward the house with unhurried steps. "I reckon they'll find something else to talk about soon enough." The interior of his home was sparse, but clean furnished with pieces that showed the hand of a master craftsman. Everything was built to last solid and unpretentious. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace that dominated one wall and a simple wooden table with 2 chairs. 2 chairs, as if he'd been expecting company. He carried her through to a smaller back room that contained a single bed, a washstand, and little else. The bed was neatly made with rough but clean linens. He set her down gently, then stepped back as if suddenly aware of the intimacy of the situation. "You'll want to rest," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "I'll bring you some food and clean water." "Mr. Cole," her voice stopped him at the doorway. "Why?" He turned back, and for a moment she saw something raw and unguarded in his expression. Pain, maybe, or recognition of pain. "Because everyone deserves better than dying alone in the desert," he said finally. "And because—" He paused, seeming to wrestle with something internal. "Because I know what it's like to be thrown away." Then he was gone, leaving her alone with questions that would take days to answer and a gratitude too large for words. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the town going about its business. Horses and wagons' voices calling to each other, the ring of the blacksmith's hammer. Normal life continuing its normal course, while she lay in a stranger's bed, saved by a miracle she still couldn't quite believe. She closed her eyes and let exhaustion claim her. But even in sleep, she could feel the solid walls around her, the roof over her head, the blanket that smelled faintly of cedar and safety. For the first time in her adult life, she was somewhere she was wanted. It wouldn't be easy, she knew. There would be talk, questions, judgments. Ethan Cole had just complicated his life considerably by bringing her here. But as she drifted off to sleep, she found herself hoping, really hoping for the first time in years, that maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place where she could stay. The afternoon sun slanted through the single window, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere in the front room, she could hear the quiet sounds of a man moving carefully, trying not to disturb her rest. The sound of someone who cared whether she was comfortable. In 3 days, she'd gone from abandoned to rescued, from dying to hoping. It was enough to make a person believe in miracles again, or at least in the miracle of one good man who'd looked at a broken woman and seen someone worth saving. She woke to the sound of wood being worked, the steady rhythm of a plane shaving curls from pine, the soft thud of chisel meeting timber. For a moment, suspended between sleep and consciousness, Lydia couldn't place where she was. Then memory flooded back the desert, the dying, the miracle of strong arms lifting her from certain death. The light filtering through the window told her it was late afternoon. She'd slept for hours, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion now that it felt safe enough to do so. The sounds from the workshop continued, methodical, patient, the work of a man who found peace in creation. A glass of water sat on the simple wooden table beside the bed, along with a bowl of what looked like broth and a piece of fresh bread. Her stomach cramped at the sight, reminding her that she hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. But first, she needed to understand her situation more clearly. Sitting up took more effort than it should have, her weakened body protesting every movement. The room spun gently, and she gripped the edge of the bed until it steadied. Her legs lay useless beneath the blanket, as they always had. But somehow the familiar limitation felt different here. Less like a prison sentence, more like simply one aspect of who she was. The water was cool and clean, tasting of the deep well, rather than the metallic tang of canteen water. She sipped it slowly, letting her throat adjust, then reached for the broth. It was simple but nourishing chicken and vegetables in a clear stock that warmed her from the inside out. Someone had taken care to make it easy to digest for a person who'd been starving. As she ate, she listened to the sounds from the workshop and tried to piece together what she knew about Ethan Cole. He was a craftsman, clearly skilled given the quality of the furniture she could see even in this simple room. He lived alone, which was unusual for a man of his apparent means in a town like Copper Ridge. Most successful men his age would have married by now. Started families, established themselves as pillars of the community. But there had been something in his eyes when he'd said he knew what it was like to be thrown away. A recognition that spoke of shared experience with rejection, with being deemed unworthy or inconvenient. What had happened to him? What had carved those lines of solitude into his face? The workshop sound stopped, and she heard footsteps approaching the house. A soft knock came at the doorframe. "Miss Cross, you awake?" "Yes." She called, her voice still hoarse but stronger than before. "Please come in." He entered carrying a steaming cup and another blanket, his movements careful and deliberate. In the afternoon light, she could see him more clearly than she had in the harsh desert sun. He was probably in his early 30s, with the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from honest work and clean living. But there was something guarded in his expression, a wall that kept the world at a careful distance. "Brought you some tea," he said, setting the cup on the table. "Nothing fancy, just mint and honey. Should help with your throat." "Thank you." She accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her hands around its warmth. "And thank you for everything. I know this must be complicated for you." He shrugged, but she caught the way his jaw tightened slightly. "Town talk doesn't concern me much. But it exists." "It exists," he acknowledged. He remained standing, clearly uncomfortable with the intimacy of the situation, but too polite to leave abruptly. "I was thinking when you're feeling stronger, we should probably figure out what you need. Clothes, medicines, things like that." The practical question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither seemed ready to address directly. Where would she go? What would she do? How long could she impose on his unexpected kindness? "I don't have any money," she said quietly. "My family took everything when they left. That's not what I'm worried about right now." Something in his tone made her look at him more closely. There was anger there, carefully controlled but unmistakable. Not anger at her, but at the situation, at the people who'd created it. "You don't understand," she pressed. "I can't work not like other people. I can't earn my keep or contribute anything meaningful. You're what?" The question came out sharper than he'd probably intended. He caught himself, softened his voice. "Sorry, I've heard enough people talk about what they can't do to last me a lifetime." The words held weight that suggested personal experience. Before she could respond, he continued, "Besides, there's all kinds of work in this world. Some of it doesn't require walking around. Such as..." He was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider his words carefully. "Well, there's sewing for one. Mending, tailoring, that sort of thing. Always need for that. And bookkeeping, lots of businesses could use someone good with numbers. Teaching, if you've got the education for it." "You think someone would hire me?" The question came out smaller than she'd intended, revealing more hope than she'd meant to show. "I think you'd be surprised what people will overlook if you can do something they need done." There was something almost fierce in his conviction, as if he were arguing against voices she couldn't hear. She found herself wondering again what had shaped him, what experiences had taught him to see possibility where others saw only limitation. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He nodded, though his posture suggested he was bracing himself. "Why did you stop? Really, all those other people saw me and kept going, but you stopped. Why?" For a long moment, he didn't answer. He moved to the window, looking out at something she couldn't see, his hands clasped behind his back. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant. Had a sister once, younger than me. She was born with a twisted foot, not as bad as what you're dealing with, but bad enough that she couldn't run and play like other children. My father was a hard man, believed anything that wasn't perfect was God's way of showing displeasure. Lydia's heart began to beat faster. Past tense. Had a sister. When the drought came, when money got tight, he started talking about how some burdens were too heavy to carry. How the Lord sometimes called the weak home to spare them further suffering. Ethan's jaw worked silently for a moment. I was 14. Old enough to work, but too young to stand up to him the way I should have. What happened? Left her at a mission station 2 towns over. Said it was for her own good that they'd take better care of her than we could. I believed him, wanted to believe him. He turned from the window, and she saw something raw and unhealed in his expression. Found out later the mission had been closed for months. She died there alone, waiting for people who were never coming back. The silence that followed was heavy with shared understanding. 2 people who'd been abandoned, 2 different outcomes, both shaped by the casual cruelty of those who found it easier to discard than to care. "I'm sorry," Lydia whispered. Her name was Sarah. She would have been about your age now. He met her eyes directly for the first time since beginning his story. "So when I saw you there, in the desert, I saw her. I saw the chance to do what I should have done 20 years ago." The weight of that revelation settled between them. She understood now why he'd brought her here, why he seemed so determined to help despite the complications it would create. This wasn't just rescue, it was redemption. "I can't be her," Lydia said gently. "I can't fix what happened to Sarah." "I know that." His voice was rough. "But maybe I can make sure it doesn't happen again. At least not while I'm around to prevent it." The tea had cooled in her hands while they talked, but she barely noticed. Something fundamental had shifted between them, a wall of polite distance replaced by honest recognition. They were both damaged people, but perhaps that damage could be the foundation for something stronger than either could build alone. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you rest and get your strength back. Then we figure out the next step. People will talk. Let them talk. They'll say things about you harboring a strange woman, about impropriety." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Miss Cross, I've been the subject of town gossip for years. Adding to it won't kill me." "What do they say about you?" "That I'm strange, antisocial, that I must have done something terrible back east to end up here alone." He shrugged. "Some of it's even true." Before she could ask what he meant by that, he was moving toward the door. "I'll let you rest some more. There's fresh water in the pitcher, and I'll bring supper in a few hours." "Ethan." The use of his first name stopped him. "Thank you. Not just for the rescue, but for seeing me as a person. It's been a long time since anyone did that." Something shifted in his expression, softening the hard edges that seemed to be his default defense against the world. "You are a person, Lydia. Don't let anyone tell you different." After he left, she lay back against the pillows and tried to process everything that had happened. In the span of a single day, she'd gone from dying alone to being safe in the home of a man who understood loss in ways she'd never expected. The tea grew cold as she stared at the ceiling and wondered if this was what hope felt like after years of its absence. The days that followed fell into a careful rhythm. Ethan would bring her meals and check on her condition, but he gave her space to recover without hovering. During the long afternoon hours, she could hear him working in his shop, the whisper of sandpaper, the percussion of hammer on nail, the steady back and forth of a saw biting through timber. She began to venture out of the bedroom once her strength returned, first to the main room of the house, then to the covered porch where she could sit in the shade and watch the life of Copper Ridge unfold around her. The town was bigger than she'd realized from her brief previous visit, with maybe 200 souls scattered across its dusty streets and adobe buildings. People noticed her, of course. How could they not? A strange woman sitting on the porch of the town's most private citizen was bound to draw attention. Some stares were curious, some pitying, a few hostile. But gradually, as the days passed without scandal or drama, the novelty began to wear off. It was during her third week in Ethan's home that she ventured into his workshop for the first time. He was bent over a piece of pine, carving intricate details into what would become the back of a chair. The afternoon light caught the concentration in his face, the absolute focus that transformed mere wood into art. "That's beautiful work," she said from the doorway. He looked up, startled. He'd been so absorbed that he hadn't heard her approach. "Didn't mean to disturb you," she added quickly. "I was just curious about what you were making." "Dining set for the banker's wife. She wants something fancy for her parlor." He set down his carving tools and straightened, working a kink out of his back. "You're moving around better?" "I feel stronger. More like myself again." She moved carefully into the workshop, using her arms to pull herself along the workbench. The space smelled of sawdust and linseed oil, clean, an honest sense that spoke of creation rather than destruction. Tools hung in precise order along the walls, and several pieces in various stages of completion occupied different corners of the room. "You're entirely self-taught?" she asked, running her hand along the smooth surface of a partially finished table. "My father was a furniture maker back in Ohio. Taught me the basics before—" He caught himself leaving the sentence unfinished. "Before what?" "Before we had our falling out." He busied himself organizing tools that were already perfectly organized. "Let's just say we disagreed about more than woodworking techniques." She studied his profile, seeing the tension that mentioning his father had created. Another piece of his story, another wound that had never properly healed. "This Sarah you mentioned, she was part of that falling out." "She was the heart of it." His hands stilled on the tools. "When I realized what I'd let happen to her, I had some things to say to the man who called himself our father. He had some things to say back. In the end, I decided Ohio wasn't big enough for both of us." "So you came here?" "Came here." He turned to face her, leaning against the workbench. "Started over. Built this place, established my business, tried to make peace with what I'd done and what I'd failed to do." "And had you made peace?" "I thought I had, until I saw you in that desert." The weight of that admission hung between them. She understood that her presence here was about more than simple charity. It was about a man trying to balance scales that had been weighted with guilt for 20 years. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, "about what you said about different kinds of work." "Oh, I can sew. My mother made sure I learned, said it was one of the few useful things a girl like me could do." The memory carried its usual sting, but somehow less sharp than before. "And I can read and write to figures. Had a good teacher before things got difficult at home. That's more education than most people in this territory can claim. The thing is, I've been sitting on that porch for weeks watching people go by. This town could use a seamstress. I see plenty of torn clothes and poor mending work." Ethan was quiet, considering. "You'd want to set up some kind of business. I'd want to contribute something. Pay my way." She met his eyes directly. "I won't be a burden, Ethan. Not to you or anyone else." "You're not a burden? Then let me prove it." Something in her tone must have convinced him, because he nodded slowly. "What would you need?" "Fabric thread needles. A good pair of shears. Maybe some way to let people know I'm available for work." "I could build you a proper workspace. Here in the shop or in the house, if you'd prefer." "Here would be perfect." if you don't mind sharing the space. I don't mind. The conversation had taken on an undertone of permanence that neither of them addressed directly. They were talking about setting up a business, about sharing workspace, about her place in the life of Copper Ridge. All of it assumed she would be staying, that whatever arrangement they'd fallen into would continue indefinitely. People will really talk then, she said. A man and woman working together, living under the same roof without being married. Let them talk. It could hurt your business. My business is based on the quality of my work, not the approval of gossips. Still, she hesitated, then forged ahead. There are ways to make it more proper, if that matters to you. He went very still. What ways? We could marry. The words came out in a rush, as if speed might make them less shocking. I know it's not. I mean, it wouldn't have to be a real marriage. Just a legal arrangement to satisfy propriety. I wouldn't expect that. I understand that you're helping me out of charity, not... Stop! The single word cut through her rambling explanation like a blade. She looked up to find him staring at her with an expression she couldn't read. First of all, he said quietly, this isn't charity. Not anymore. What is it then? I don't know yet. But it's not charity. Her heart did something complicated in her chest, a flutter of possibility that she didn't dare name. Second, he continued, if we ever have that conversation, it won't be because of what the town thinks or doesn't think. It'll be because we both want it. And third, you just offered to marry a man you've known for 3 weeks. Either you're more desperate than I thought, or you're braver than anyone has a right to be. Heat flooded her cheeks. I'm practical. Marriage would solve several problems at once. Problems. He shook his head. Listen to yourself. Marriage should be about more than solving problems. Should be, maybe. But for people like us, it's often about survival. People like us. Broken people. Discarded people. People who don't have the luxury of marrying for love. The silence that followed was charged with unspoken truths. She'd laid her cards on the table with brutal honesty. This was what she believed she deserved, what she thought was possible for someone like her. You think you're broken? Ethan said finally. I know I'm broken. Because you can't walk. Because I'm not complete. Because I come with complications and limitations and what you think that makes you less worthy of being loved. The question hit her like a physical blow. Love. The word hung between them, dangerous and beautiful and utterly foreign to her understanding of her own worth. I think it makes me realistic about what's possible. Sarah used to say something like that. His voice was soft, distant. Used to tell me she knew she'd never have a real life because of her foot. Used to say she'd be grateful for whatever scraps of kindness people threw her way. Maybe she was being practical too. Maybe she was being told she was worthless so often that she started to believe it. The parallel was too obvious to ignore, too painful to acknowledge directly. Lydia turned away suddenly, unable to meet his eyes. I should get back to the house, she said. Let you get back to your work. But as she made her way to the door, his voice stopped her. Lydia. She paused, but didn't turn around. If we ever have that conversation about marriage, it won't be a business arrangement. And it won't be because I pity you. Markhams. Then why would it be? Because I want you to stay. Not because you're useful, not because I need a seamstress, not because it would make the town gossips happy. Because I want you here. She did turn then, and found him watching her with an intensity that took her breath away. I want you here, he repeated. Just you. Exactly as you are. The words carved something open inside her chest, something that had been locked away for so long, she'd forgotten it existed. Hope. Not the desperate hope of survival, but the deeper hope of being wanted for who she was rather than what she could provide. "I don't know how to believe that," she whispered. "Then don't believe it yet. Just don't dismiss it either." She nodded, not trusting her voice, and made her way back to the house on unsteady arms. Behind her, she heard him return to his work, but the rhythm seemed different now, less steady, more agitated, as if the conversation had disturbed his usual peace as much as it had hers. That evening, as they shared a simple supper at his kitchen table, the weight of unspoken possibilities settled between them like a third presence. They talked about practical things, materials she would need for sewing space in the workshop, ways to let the town know about her services, but underneath the practical conversation ran a deeper current of awareness. Something was building between them, something neither had planned or expected. It was fragile, still uncertain, built on shared damage and mutual recognition of pain. But it was real, and it was growing stronger each day. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the sagebrush, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its mate. Inside, two broken people sat across a simple wooden table and began to imagine what it might be like to be whole. Reessaye. The first customer arrived on a Tuesday morning in early October, when the desert air finally carried the promise of cooler days ahead. Lydia was seated at the workstation Ethan had built for her in a corner of his shop. A sturdy table positioned to catch the morning light, with drawers for supplies and a comfortable chair, cushioned with scraps of wool felt. She was mending a torn seam in one of Ethan's work shirts when she heard hesitant footsteps at the door. "Excuse me." A woman's voice, uncertain but determined. "I heard there might be someone here who does sewing." Lydia looked up to see Mrs. Margaret Henley, the postmaster's wife, standing in the doorway with a bundle of cloth in her arms. She was a thin woman in her 40s, weathered by frontier life, but still carrying herself with the careful dignity of someone who'd known better days. "That would be me," Lydia replied, setting aside Ethan's shirt. "I'm Lydia Cross. How can I help you?" Mrs. Henley stepped inside, her eyes taking in the workshop with its neat arrangement of tools and partially completed furniture. Her gaze lingered on Lydia's legs, folded beneath her in the chair, but her expression remained carefully neutral. "I have a dress," she said, unfolding the bundle to reveal a garment of deep blue cotton. "It belonged to my late sister. She was considerably smaller than I am, and I was hoping I wondered if it might be possible to let it out somehow." Lydia examined the dress with practiced eyes. The fabric was good quality, the original construction solid, but it would need significant alteration to fit Mrs. Henley's broader frame. "It's possible," she said finally. "I can add panels at the side seams and adjust the bodice. It won't be invisible work, but I can use contrasting fabric in a way that makes it look intentional, like decoration rather than alteration." "You could do that?" Hope flickered in the woman's tired eyes. "I could. May I ask, is there particular sentimental value to this dress?" Mrs. Henley's hand smoothed over the fabric with reverent care. "She wore it to her wedding. It's all I have left of her, really. When the cholera took her family, I promised myself I'd find a way to honor her memory." The weight of that trust settled on Lydia's shoulders. This wasn't just alterations, it was preservation of love, of memory, of the thin threads that connected the living to the lost. "I'll take very good care of it," she promised, "and I'll make sure it's beautiful when it's finished." They negotiated a fair price, and Mrs. Henley left the dress with obvious reluctance and equally obvious relief. After she was gone, Lydia sat holding the blue cotton and marveling at what had just happened. Someone had trusted her with their most precious possession. Someone had seen value in her skills, her ability to create and preserve and make beautiful. "First customer?" Ethan asked from across the shop where he was assembling the components of a cabinet. "First customer," she confirmed, unable to keep the wonder out of her voice. How does it feel? Terrifying. Wonderful. Like I matter? He looked up from his work then, and she saw pride in his expression. Not pity, not surprise, but genuine pride in her accomplishment. You do matter, he said simply and went back to his cabinet. Word spread quickly in a town the size of Copper Ridge. By the end of the week, Lydia had 3 more customers, a rancher's wife who needed children's clothes taken in as they outgrew them, a saloon girl who wanted a dress made respectable enough for church, and the banker's wife who'd heard about the seamstress and wanted to see samples of her work. Each interaction was a small revelation. People saw her legs, yes, but then they saw her work. They talked to her about their needs, their families, their lives. She was becoming part of the fabric of the community in a way she'd never imagined possible. The work itself was deeply satisfying. There was something almost meditative about the precise movements of needle through fabric, the gradual transformation of shapeless cloth into garments that would be worn and treasured. Her fingers had never been so busy, her mind so engaged with problems that had solutions rather than limitations that had none. But it wasn't just the work that was changing her. It was the way Ethan looked at her as she bent over her sewing, the quiet pride he took in her success. It was the way he'd started asking her opinion about his own projects, as if her thoughts mattered. It was the easy rhythm they'd fallen into, sharing meals and conversation, and the comfortable silence of 2 people absorbed in work they loved. The town was noticing too. Dr. Mitchell made a point of nodding when he passed the shop. The general store owner's wife stopped by to admire a shawl Lydia was embroidering. Even Sheriff Barnes, a taciturn man who rarely spoke to anyone unless duty required it, had complimented the mending she'd done on his uniform. But with acceptance came scrutiny, and with scrutiny came questions that were harder to answer. People are starting to wonder about your arrangement, Mrs. Henley mentioned during her second visit when she came to collect her altered dress. Living here together, working together. It's not that anyone thinks ill of either of you, you understand, but it's unusual, Lydia finished. Unusual, yes. And in a town like this, unusual makes people nervous. Lydia had been expecting this conversation, but it still made her stomach tighten with anxiety. She'd found a place where she belonged, work that gave her purpose, and a man who saw her as more than her limitations. The thought of losing it all to social propriety was almost unbearable. What do people suggest should be done about it? She asked carefully. Mrs. Henley fidgeted with her reticule. Well, most folks figure you'll either move on to more suitable arrangements or make the current ones more permanent. More permanent? Marriage, dear. Most people assume that's where this is heading anyway. That evening, Lydia found herself staring into the fire Ethan had built against the autumn chill, thinking about permanence and assumptions and the gap between what people expected and what was actually possible. Ethan sat across from her sketching designs for a bookshelf in the flickering light, apparently oblivious to her internal turmoil. Mrs. Henley thinks we should get married, she said without preamble. His pencil stopped moving. Does she now? She says people are wondering about our arrangement. I imagine they are. He set down his sketchbook and looked at her directly. What do you think about what Mrs. Henley thinks? I think she's probably right about what people are expecting. That's not what I asked. The directness of his gaze made her heart race. This was the conversation they'd been dancing around for weeks, the question that hung in the air between them, every time they shared a meal or worked side by side in comfortable companionship. I think, she said slowly, that I don't know how to want things for myself anymore. I've spent so many years being told what wasn't possible that I've forgotten how to imagine what might be. Then maybe it's time to remember. What if I remember wrong? What if I want something I can't have? What if you want something you can have, but you're too afraid to reach for it? She stood then, needing movement to contain the restless energy his words had stirred. She made her way to the window, looking out at the stars that blazed with desert clarity above Copper Ridge. "In all those years growing up," she said, "I used to watch other girls my age getting courted, getting married, starting families. I told myself it didn't matter because it was never going to be possible for me anyway. But sometimes late at night, I'd imagine what it would feel like to be wanted like that. To be someone's choice rather than someone's burden." Behind her, she heard him rise from his chair, heard his footsteps cross the room. He stopped just behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body, but not touching. "You're not imagining it now," he said quietly. "You are someone's choice." She turned and found herself looking up into his face, seeing something there that made her breath catch. It wasn't pity or obligation, or even simple kindness. It was want raw and honest, and directed entirely at her. "Ethan, I know what you're going to say. That I'm confusing gratitude with something deeper, or that you don't want to trap me in something I'll regret. But you'd be wrong. How can you be sure? Because I've been alone for 20 years, Lydia. I know the difference between solitude and loneliness, between helping someone and needing them." His hand rose to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "I need you. Not because you're grateful or convenient, or because marrying you would solve problems. I need you because when you're not here, this house feels empty. Because your voice is the first thing I want to hear in the morning, and the last thing I want to hear at night. Because watching you discover what you're capable of is better than anything I've ever built with my own hands." The words washed over her like warm rain on parched earth. She'd never heard anyone speak about wanting her with such simple conviction, such absence of qualification or reservation. "I'm not what people expect in a wife," she whispered. "I don't care what people expect. I can't give you children. You don't know that. And if it's true, it doesn't change how I feel. I'll never be able to work alongside you in all the ways a frontier wife should. You already work alongside me. You already contribute more to our life together than most wives ever do. Our life together." The phrase hung between them, full of promise and possibility. "When you say it like that, you make it sound so simple." Maybe it is simple. Maybe we've been making it complicated because we're both afraid of wanting something good. She studied his face, seeing the sincerity there, the hope he was trying to contain. This man had pulled her back from the edge of death, had given her shelter and purpose, and something she was only now beginning to recognize as love. Not the dramatic, all-consuming love of storybooks, but something steadier and more durable, the love of recognition of two damaged souls finding completeness in each other. "Ask me," she said. "What? Ask me properly. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right." Something shifted in his expression, vulnerability giving way to determination. He took both her hands in his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Lydia Cross," he said, his voice formal but warm. "Will you marry me? Will you be my wife, my partner, my companion? For whatever years we have left, will you help me turn this house into a home and this work into a life worth living?" Tears she hadn't expected pricked her eyes. No one had ever asked her for anything that mattered before, never sought her partnership or her companionship or her love. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." He kissed her then, and it was nothing like the kisses she'd imagined in her girlish dreams. It was better, real and warm and full of promise rather than fantasy. It tasted of coffee and hope and the sweet relief of finally coming home. When they broke apart, she was breathless and laughing and crying all at once. "This is really happening," she said. "This is really happening," he confirmed. "People are going to have opinions." Let them have opinions. Mrs. Henley is going to be insufferably pleased with herself. Mrs. Henley deserves to be pleased. She's a wise woman. They were married 3 weeks later by Judge Patterson in the front room of Ethan's house. Their house now with Mrs. Henley and her husband serving as witnesses and half the town crowding onto the porch to observe the ceremony. Lydia wore the blue dress she'd altered for Mrs. Henley, which the woman had insisted on giving back as a wedding gift, and Ethan wore his best suit with a white shirt she'd sewn for him herself. It was a simple ceremony, but it felt profound in ways that elaborate weddings often didn't. When Judge Patterson pronounced them husband and wife, when Ethan kissed her in front of God and the territory of New Mexico and the assembled gossips of Copper Ridge, Lydia felt something settle into place inside her chest. She belonged here. She belonged to someone, and someone belonged to her. The reception was held in their workshop with tables made from sawhorses and planks, and food contributed by neighbors who'd apparently been waiting for an excuse to celebrate. Mrs. Henley had organized the whole affair with military precision, turning what could have been an awkward social event into something warm and welcoming. "I have to admit," Sheriff Barnes said, approaching their makeshift head table with a plate of Mrs. Patterson's famous apple cake, "I had my doubts about this arrangement at first. Seemed irregular." "And now?" Ethan asked mildly. "Now I think you two are probably the most sensible people in this town. You saw what you wanted, and you went after it. Social conventions be damned." He raised his coffee cup in a toast. "Here's to irregular arrangements that work." As the afternoon wore on and the celebration gradually wound down, Lydia found herself watching her new husband as he talked with their guests, accepting congratulations and gentle ribbing with equal grace. There was something different about him today, a lightness she'd never seen before, as if some weight he'd been carrying for years had finally been lifted. "Happy?" he asked, appearing beside her chair as the last of the guests prepared to leave. "Terrified," she admitted. "But happy?" "Good terrified or bad terrified?" "Good terrified, I think. The kind that comes from having something precious to lose." He leaned down to kiss the top of her head, a gesture so casual and affectionate that it took her breath away. "You're not going to lose it," he said. "You're not going to lose me." That night, as they sat by the fire in their house, Lydia reflected on the improbable journey that had brought her here. 6 months ago, she'd been dying alone in the desert, abandoned by everyone who should have protected her. Tonight, she was a married woman, with a trade, a home, and a future that stretched ahead full of possibility. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stopped that day?" she asked. Ethan considered the question seriously. "I try not to think about it. It's too terrible to imagine. I think about it sometimes. Not in a morbid way, but just marveling at how different things could have been. How many small decisions led to this moment? Like what? Like you leaving Ohio when you did. Like your father's cruelty teaching you compassion instead of hardening your heart. Like Mrs. Henley deciding to trust a strange seamstress with her sister's dress." She paused. "Like my family abandoning me in exactly the right place for you to find me. You think there was providence in it? I think there was love in it. Maybe the same thing." Outside, the desert wind had picked up, rattling the windows and sending tumbleweeds skittering across the yard. But inside, the fire burned warm and steady, and two people who'd been broken by life sat close together and discovered that sometimes the most beautiful things grew from the deepest wounds. "What do you want?" Ethan asked suddenly. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what do you want for us, for our life together? Not what you think you should want or what's practical or reasonable. What do you actually want?" The question caught her off guard with its simplicity. When had anyone ever asked her what she wanted, not what she could accept or settle for, but what she truly desired? "I want mornings like this," she said finally. "I want to wake up every day, knowing I belong somewhere, that someone is glad I exist. I want our work to matter, to create beautiful things that outlast us. I want to grow old with you and never take for granted how lucky we are to have found each other. That's all. That's everything." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. When he spoke again, his voice was soft with wonder. "You know what I realized today? During the ceremony." "What?" "For the first time in 20 years, I wasn't thinking about Sarah. Not because I've forgotten her or stopped loving her, but because I finally have something to live for, instead of something to atone for." The word settled between them like a benediction. Two broken people finding wholeness not by erasing their scars, but by accepting them as part of their story. Two lost souls discovering that home wasn't a place, but a person who chose to stay. As the fire burned low and the desert settled into its ancient silence, Lydia and Ethan made their way to bed, their bed now in their house, surrounded by their life together. And if the citizens of Copper Ridge had anything to say about their irregular courtship or unconventional marriage, they kept it to themselves. After all, some things were too beautiful to criticize, even for dedicated gossips. And what those two had found together was undeniably beautiful, a love built on mutual recognition, shared purpose, and the radical act of choosing each other, despite everything the world had taught them about their own unworthiness. It was the kind of love that changed not just the people who lived it, but everyone who witnessed it. The kind of love that reminded a tired frontier town that miracles still happened, that grace still existed, and that sometimes the most profound redemption came disguised as ordinary human kindness. Their first winter as husband and wife tested them in ways neither had anticipated. The desert that had nearly claimed Lydia's life revealed another face entirely, howling winds that rattled the windows like skeleton fingers, temperatures that plunged below freezing, and snow that transformed the familiar landscape into something alien and beautiful and dangerous. But inside their home, warmth prevailed. The workshop had become the heart of their shared existence, where the sound of Ethan's plane harmonized with the whisper of Lydia's needle through fabric. Orders had increased as a word of their skills spread beyond Copper Ridge to neighboring settlements. Ranchers rode in from 50 miles away, seeking Ethan's sturdy tables and chairs, while their wives commissioned Lydia to create dresses worthy of territorial social functions. It was during one of these visits, in early February, that their carefully constructed piece first showed cracks. The rider appeared at their door on a bitter morning when ice glazed the windows and the workshop stove worked overtime to keep the space habitable. Lydia was finishing the beadwork on a wedding dress for the territorial governor's daughter when she heard unfamiliar voices outside, harsh, demanding tones that made her hands still on the delicate fabric. "That him?" The voice carried the flat vowels of back east, specifically Ohio. The boy who ran off after disgracing his family. Ethan's response was too quiet to hear through the walls, but the tension in his posture was visible even from where Lydia sat. She watched him set down his chisel with deliberate care, his movements controlled in the way of a man preparing for trouble. 20 years? The stranger continued louder now, as if volume might enhance his authority. 20 years since you tucked tail and ran, leaving your poor mother to explain your cowardice to decent folk. Lydia's blood turned cold. This could only be someone from Ethan's past, someone who knew about Sarah, about the guilt that had driven him to the frontier. She made her way carefully to the window, positioning herself where she could see without being observed. The man in their yard was perhaps 60, gray-bearded, and dressed in the somber black of a traveling preacher. But his eyes held no compassion, only the hard gleam of someone who'd found a weapon he intended to use. Behind him sat a younger man on horseback bearing enough resemblance to suggest family relation. "Reverend Cross," Ethan said, his voice carrying across the frozen air with careful neutrality. "Been a long time." Cross. The name hit Lydia like a physical blow. This was her father, who had abandoned her to die in the desert, now standing in her yard, confronting her husband. The coincidence seemed impossible, too cruel to be mere chance. "Not near long enough from what I hear," Reverend Cross replied. "Thought you might have learned Christian values out here in the wilderness. But instead I find you living in sin, with a crippled woman who seduces godly men with her afflictions." The words struck Lydia like physical blows. She'd known this moment would come, eventually had known that her past would catch up with her, that her family's version of events would spread and find ears willing to believe the worst. But hearing the venom in her father's voice, the casual way he dismissed both her humanity and her marriage, made her stomach revolt. Ethan's response was low and dangerous. "That woman is my wife, legally married before God and witnesses. And if you ever speak about her like that again, Reverend, or not, you'll be picking yourself up off the ground." "Wife?" Cross laughed a sound like breaking glass. "What kind of Christian marriage can exist between a woman cursed by God and a man who abandoned his own blood? The Lord sees all, boy. He knows what manner of creatures you both are. The Lord also sees what manner of man abandons his daughter to die alone in the desert." Ethan shot back. "So maybe we should talk about Christian values after all." The words hung in the frozen air between them, heavy with accusation and truth. Lydia saw her father's face change, surprise giving way to calculation, as he realized Ethan knew exactly who he was dealing with. "That girl chose her path," Cross said finally. "Chose to burden her family with her demands and complaints until we had no choice but to trust her to the Lord's mercy. You left her to die. I left her to Providence. There's a difference. Not from where I'm standing." The younger man on horseback shifted nervously, his eyes darting between the two older men as tension ratcheted higher. Lydia recognized him now, her brother Samuel, barely 16 when she'd last seen him, now grown into a man who bore their father's harsh features but seemed uncomfortable with his errand. "The point is," Cross continued, "I've come to collect what's mine. That woman has property that belongs to her family, her mother's Bible, some jewelry, household items we need returned." "She doesn't have anything that belongs to you," Ethan replied flatly. "You forfeited any claim when you abandoned her. Blood claims don't disappear because of geography, boy. I'm her father and I have rights. You're a stranger who happened to contribute to her birth. Fathers protect their children. They don't throw them away when they become inconvenient." Cross's face darkened with rage. "You forget yourself. I am a man of God, ordained to minister to lost souls and correct the wayward. This marriage of yours, if it can even be called that, is an abomination. A healthy man binding himself to damaged goods, living off her earnings, while she plays at being useful." That was the breaking point. Lydia heard the workshop door slam open with enough force to rattle the building's frame. When Ethan emerged, his face was set in lines she had never seen before, cold fury barely contained by iron will. "Get off my property," he said, his voice carrying the finality of a closing door. "Get off my property and don't come back. I'll not be dismissed by some frontier carpenter who thinks he can live outside God's law," Cross snarled. "That girl is an affliction sent to test the faithful, and you've failed that test. I'll see this unholy union dissolved if I have to petition the territorial court." "Samuel." Ethan's attention shifted to the younger man who had remained silent throughout the confrontation. "You have something to say about this?" Samuel Cross looked profoundly uncomfortable, his eyes fixed on his horse's neck rather than meeting anyone's gaze. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and strained. "I never wanted to come here," he said. "Told him it wasn't right bothering folks who weren't bothering nobody. But you came anyway. He's my father, and he said she might be in trouble, might need help." The painful irony of that statement hung in the air. Help from the men who'd left her to die. She has help, Ethan said simply. She has a husband who loves her and a life worth living. She doesn't need anything from either of you. Love, Cross spat. You call it love, this perverse attraction to broken things. This need to play savior to creatures God has marked for suffering. I call it choosing to see value where others see only problems. Something you might understand if you'd ever loved anyone more than your own righteous reputation. The insult struck home. Cross's face went pale with rage, and for a moment Lydia thought he might actually strike Ethan. Instead, he pulled himself upright in his stirrups and pointed an accusing finger. Mark my words, boy. This will not stand. I'll see the authorities make them understand what manner of situation exists here. A decent woman, mentally afflicted by her physical limitations, taken advantage of by a man with no moral center. Mentally afflicted. The new voice came from the doorway of the house, clear and strong, despite the cold. Lydia had emerged wrapped in a heavy shawl, but standing straight and proud. Is that what you're telling people about me now, Father? The title dripped with contempt that made Cross flinch. Samuel's eyes widened with shock. He'd clearly expected to find the broken, dependent creature their father had described, not the self-possessed woman who faced them without fear. Lydia. Samuel's voice cracked slightly on her name. You look different. I look like someone who's learned her worth, she replied. Someone who's discovered that being different doesn't mean being worthless. Cross recovered his composure with visible effort. You look like a woman who's forgotten her place and her duty to her family. My duty? Lydia's laugh was sharp as winter wind. My duty was to die quietly in the desert so you wouldn't have to feel guilty about abandoning me. But I survived despite your best efforts. I survived and built a life and married a good man who sees value in things you'd throw away. This man has filled your head with prideful nonsense. A woman in your condition should be grateful for any attention, not demanding to be treated as an equal. A woman in my condition, Lydia repeated slowly, runs a successful business, contributes to her community, and has the respect of her neighbors. A woman in my condition is loved by a man who chose her freely, not because he pitied her, but because he values her mind and her heart and her spirit. Impossible. No decent man would abandon his child, Ethan interrupted. But here we are. The exchange had drawn attention from neighbors who watched from windows and doorways with undisguised curiosity. Mrs. Henley appeared at her gate, clearly prepared to intervene if the situation escalated further. Sheriff Barnes had materialized at the end of the street, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. You're making a spectacle, Cross hissed. Drawing decent people into your sordid affairs? The only spectacle here is a so-called man of God harassing citizens in good standing. Sheriff Barnes called out, his voice carrying the authority of law and community approval. Might be time to move along, Reverend. This is family business, Sheriff. Private matters. Nothing private about it when you're shouting in the middle of town. And nothing family about it when you abandoned the lady in question to die in the desert. Barnes stepped closer, his weathered face set in hard lines. We take a dim view of that sort of behavior in Copper Ridge. Cross looked around the growing circle of hostile faces and seemed to realize that his moral authority carried no weight here. These people knew Lydia, and Ethan knew their character and their contributions to the community. Whatever stories he'd planned to tell about afflicted women and predatory men found no receptive audience. This isn't finished, he said, finally gathering his reins. There are higher authorities than small-town sheriff's courts that understand proper Christian order. There are also laws about harassment, Barnes replied pleasantly. and disturbing the peace. Might want to keep that in mind if you're planning a longer visit. But it was Samuel who delivered the final blow to his father's retreat. The young man had been watching the exchange with growing discomfort, and when he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of long-suppressed doubt. "She looks happy, Pa," he said quietly. "Maybe that's worth something." Cross turned on his son with fury. "Worth something, worth abandoning. Christian duty and natural law, worth encouraging the weak to forget their place. Worth letting people live their lives without interference from folks who don't know what they're talking about." The rebellion in Samuel's voice was quiet but unmistakable. For perhaps the first time in his life, he was questioning his father's absolute authority, and the realization seemed to shake Cross more than anything else that had happened. "Get down from that horse," Cross ordered. "We're going home." "No, sir," Samuel replied, his voice growing stronger. "I think I'll stay for a while. See how my sister's getting along." The word sister hung in the air between them, an acknowledgement of relationship that Cross had spent years trying to deny. His face went through a series of expressions before settling on cold disgust. "Then you're no son of mine," he said finally. "Choose your path, boy, but don't come crying to me when you discover what consorting with the cursed brings down on your head." He spurred his horse viciously and rode out of town without looking back, leaving Samuel sitting alone in the Coles yard with the weight of severed family ties settling on his shoulders. The silence that followed was broken by Mrs. Henley's practical voice. "Samuel Cross, you look half frozen. Come inside and get some coffee before you catch your death." The kindness in her tone seemed to undo something in the young man's composure. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment he looked much younger than his years. "Don't know if I should," he said. "Don't know if she'd want me here after everything." Lydia studied her brother's face, seeing echoes of the boy she'd once known beneath the man he'd become. She saw shame there, and regret, and a desperate hope for forgiveness he was afraid to ask for directly. "You never wanted to leave me," she said finally. "I could see it in your eyes that morning." "Didn't matter what I wanted. I was 16 and scared, and now you're not 16 anymore." Samuel looked up at her, then really looked, and she saw him taking inventory of what she'd become, the strength in her posture, the confidence in her voice, the obvious devotion of the man standing beside her. "No," he agreed. "I'm not 16 anymore." "Then come inside," Ethan said, his anger cooling into practical hospitality. "It's too cold to have family conversations in the yard." The inclusion in that word family seemed to surprise Samuel as much as it did Lydia. But he dismounted and followed them into the house, accepting Mrs. Henley's offer of hot coffee and the chance to warm himself by their fire. Over the next several hours, the full story of Lydia's abandonment emerged in painful detail. Samuel had been told she was going to stay with relatives who could better care for her needs. He'd believed it until they were already miles from the drop-off point, and his father had let slip the truth. By then it was too late to go back, or rather his father had made it clear that going back wasn't an option. "Told me it was God's will," Samuel said, staring into his coffee cup. "That she'd been born, afflicted to test our faith, and keeping her beyond what was reasonable would be interfering with divine plan." "And you believed him?" Lydia asked, though not unkindly. "I wanted to believe him, because believing him meant I wasn't responsible for what happened to you." "You weren't responsible. You were a child. Old enough to know right from wrong. Old enough to stand up for what I believed in. Like you did today." Samuel's smile was bitter. 20 years too late, but not too late to matter." The conversation stretched into evening, covering 20 years of separation grief and misunderstanding. Samuel told them about their mother's death 2 years after Lydia's abandonment, about how she'd spent her final days asking about the daughter she'd lost. He told them about the guilt that had eaten at him, the way he'd started questioning everything their father preached as he grew old enough to see the contradictions. In return, Lydia shared the story of her rescue and recovery, her growing business, her unexpected marriage to a man who saw her as complete rather than broken. She showed Samuel her workshop, her beautiful finished pieces, the evidence of a life lived with purpose and dignity. "You did all this?" he asked, running his hands over an intricate embroidered shawl. "I did all this. And people pay you for it, respect you for it. They do." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the reality of his sister's transformation. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "I'm glad you survived," he said simply. "I'm glad you found someone who sees what I should have seen all along." "What's that?" "That you were never the problem. The problem was with people who couldn't see past their own fear and prejudice." That evening, as Samuel prepared to make camp in their barn, he'd refused the offer of staying in town, saying he needed time to think. Lydia found herself on the porch with Ethan wrapped in his coat and watching stars emerge in the clear desert sky. "He can stay as long as he needs to," Ethan said without being asked. "Even though his being here might cause more trouble with their father, especially because of that. Man's got to make his own choice about what kind of person he wants to be. Sounds like he's finally ready to make it." Lydia leaned into her husband's solid warmth, thinking about family and choice, and the strange ways that love could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. "Do you think Cross will really try to cause legal trouble?" "He might try. Won't get far. We're legally married, you're obviously competent to make your own decisions, and we've got the support of the community. Any judge would throw his petition out in 5 minutes. Still, the idea that he could try to dissolve our marriage, claim I'm not capable of consent." "Hey," Ethan's arms tightened around her. "Look at me." She turned in his embrace, seeing certainty in his pale eyes. "No one is taking you away from me," he said firmly. "No one is dissolving this marriage or questioning your right to choose your own life. I won't let it happen. You can't control everything, Ethan. Sometimes the law is on our side. But even if it wasn't, even if somehow he found a sympathetic judge, I'd take you somewhere safe. We'd start over, build a new life, find new customers." His hands framed her face gently. "I meant what I said in those vows, Lydia. For better or worse, in sickness and health, until death do us part. No traveling preacher is going to change that." The fierce protectiveness in his voice warmed her more than his coat ever could. This was what security felt like, not the absence of threats, but the presence of someone willing to stand against them. "I love you." She said the words still new enough to feel like a gift every time she spoke them. "I love you too. More than I thought it was possible to love anyone." They stood together in the desert night, holding each other against whatever storms might come. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of the life they'd built together. But tonight, under the vast New Mexico sky, they had each other, and the unshakable knowledge that some bonds were strong enough to survive anything the world might throw at them. In the barn, Samuel Cross lay wakeful on a bed of clean straw, staring up at the rafters and thinking about choices and consequences and the courage it took to build a life worth living. He'd burned his bridges today, severed the last ties that bound him to a father whose version of righteousness had room for neither mercy nor love, but watching his sister and her husband together, seeing the obvious joy they took in each other's company. He thought maybe some bridges were worth burning. Maybe some families were worth losing in order to find the family that actually mattered. Outside, the desert wind sang its ancient song of endurance and survival. And inside their warm house, Lydia and Ethan Cole settled into sleep secure in the knowledge that they'd faced their first real test as a married couple and emerged stronger than before. The worst was yet to come, but they'd face it together. And together, they were stronger than any force their past could send against them. Spring came early to Copper Ridge that year, painting the desert with wildflowers and bringing with it changes that none of them had anticipated. Samuel had stayed through the winter working alongside Ethan in the shop and slowly finding his place in their unconventional family. The young man had proven himself skilled with his hands and possessed of a gentle nature that made him popular with customers who appreciated his quiet competence. But it was Lydia who noticed the change first, a subtle shift in her body's rhythm that she initially dismissed as the lingering effects of winter's confinement. When the nausea began, accompanied by an unusual fatigue that no amount of rest seemed to cure, she found herself counting days and trying to remember when she had last experienced the monthly courses that had been her body's reliable marker for over a decade. The realization when it came was so startling that she dropped the dress she'd been hemming and sat staring at nothing for a full 5 minutes. It seemed impossible after years of being told her body was too damaged for such miracles, after accepting that motherhood would never be part of her story. Yet the signs were unmistakable, familiar to any woman, despite her own lack of direct experience. She was with child. The knowledge sat inside her like a secret too large for her body to contain. For 3 days she carried it alone, afraid to speak it aloud, in case doing so might somehow make it disappear. She watched Ethan working at his bench, saw the contentment in his face as he shaped wood into beauty, and wondered how to tell him that their life was about to change in the most fundamental way possible. It was Samuel who forced the issue, though, unintentionally. He'd been helping her organize fabric in the workshop when she suddenly had to rush outside, overcome by a wave of nausea so intense she barely made it to the yard before losing her breakfast. When she straightened, wiping her mouth with a shaking hand, she found both men staring at her with concern and dawning understanding. "Lydia." Ethan's voice was careful, as if he were afraid to hope. "How long has this been going on?" "A week, maybe more." She looked between her husband and brother, seeing the same mixture of wonder and worry in both their faces. "I wanted to be sure before I said anything." "And are you sure?" She nodded, unable to trust her voice. The tears came then not of sadness, but of overwhelming joy, mixed with terror at the magnitude of what was happening to her body. Her life, their carefully constructed world. Ethan crossed the yard in 3 strides and gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of spun glass. She could feel the tremor in his hands, the way his breathing had gone unsteady with emotion. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "We're going to have a baby. Are you happy?" The question came out smaller than she'd intended, betraying fears she hadn't fully acknowledged even to herself. "I know we never really talked about it, never planned. Happy." He pulled back to look at her, and she saw tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. "Lydia, I'm terrified and thrilled and grateful beyond words. This is more than I ever dared hope for." Samuel cleared his throat awkwardly. Should I give you two some privacy?" "Stay," Lydia said quickly, reaching out to clasp her brother's hand. "You're family now. This affects all of us." The months that followed brought challenges none of them had anticipated. Lydia's pregnancy was not the easy blessing she'd hoped for, but complicated by her condition in ways that the traveling doctor who visited Copper Ridge quarterly couldn't fully explain. Her legs, already weak, seemed to grow weaker as her body devoted its energy to the growing child. Simple tasks that had become routine suddenly required assistance, and the independence she'd fought so hard to establish felt increasingly precarious. "I feel like I'm becoming helpless all over again," she confided to Ethan one evening as he helped her from her chair to their bed. The admission cost her pride, but the fear behind it was too large to carry alone. "You're not helpless," he said firmly, settling her against the pillows with gentle care. "Your body is doing the most important work it will ever do. That takes energy, takes resources. It doesn't make you less capable, it makes you miraculous. What if something goes wrong? What if the baby? What if I'm not strong enough?" The questions that haunted her midnight hours spilled out in a rush. She'd heard stories whispered among the women of frontier towns, of births gone wrong, of mothers and children, lost to complications that better medical care might have prevented. Her own body's limitations made every possibility seem more dangerous, every risk magnified. Ethan took her hands in his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Then we'll face whatever comes together. But Lydia, look at everything you've already survived. Look at what you've built from nothing. This baby is going to have the strongest mother in the territory. And the most devoted father," Samuel added from the doorway where he'd appeared with a cup of chamomile tea. The shy young man had gradually become the brother she'd never really had the chance to know, protective and caring, in ways that healed old wounds neither of them had acknowledged. As her pregnancy progressed, the community that had embraced Lydia and Ethan as a couple rallied around them with the fierce protectiveness small towns reserved for their own. Mrs. Henley appointed herself unofficial midwife and pregnancy advisor, sharing knowledge passed down through generations of frontier women. Dr. Mitchell, though his visits were infrequent, left detailed instructions for Samuel and Ethan about signs to watch for and what to do in various emergency situations. Even Sheriff Barnes took to stopping by more frequently, though he disguised his check-ins as requests for advice about some imaginary tailoring needs. The tough lawman had a surprisingly gentle way with expectant mothers, and his presence provided an additional layer of security that everyone pretended wasn't necessary, but secretly appreciated. It was during one of these visits, in late summer, when the heat lay over Copper Ridge like a suffocating blanket, that the sheriff brought news that chilled them all despite the temperature. "Thought you should know," he said, accepting a glass of cool water from Samuel. "There's been talk around the territorial capital. Someone's been spreading stories about improper situations, unfit mothers, children being endangered by parents who don't meet community standards." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Cross. Most likely. Can't prove it, but the stories have a familiar ring to them. Seems someone thinks your family situation needs official investigation." Lydia felt the familiar knot of anxiety form in her stomach. She'd thought they were past this, that her father's threat had been empty bluster. But the man was persistent in his hatreds, and the approaching birth of his grandchild seemed to have revived his determination to interfere in their lives. "What kind of investigation?" she asked. "Territorial welfare inspector. Someone empowered to assess home situations and make recommendations about child placement." Barnes's expression was grim. "Now, under normal circumstances, wouldn't amount to anything. You folks are obviously good people providing a stable home. But if the inspector comes in with preconceived notions about what makes a fit parent..." The implication hung in the air between them. An official who believed that physical disability automatically meant parental unfitness could cause tremendous problems, even if their ultimate judgment proved wrong. And in the meantime, the stress and uncertainty could be devastating to a pregnancy already complicated by physical challenges. "When?" Ethan asked quietly. "Could be any time. These territorial appointments, they don't give much notice. Inspector could show up tomorrow or next month." Was that night, as they lay together in the darkness, listening to the desert wind, Lydia felt the baby move restlessly inside her, as if responding to her own agitation. She placed her hand on the curve of her belly, marveling as always at the miracle of life growing within her imperfect body. "What if they take the baby?" she whispered. What if they decide I'm unfit and... They won't. Ethan's voice carried absolute conviction. They won't because there's no evidence to support such a decision. They won't because this community will stand with us. They won't because I'll move us somewhere safe before I let anyone separate our family. You can't know that for certain. I can know that I'll fight for you and our child with everything I have. I can know that Samuel feels the same way. I can know that Mrs. Henley would probably shoot anyone who tried to take a baby from its mother. Despite the gravity of the situation, there was a trace of humor in his voice, and I can know that sometimes love is stronger than law, and what we have is strong enough to overcome whatever your father can throw at us. The baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly vigorous kick, as if agreeing with its father's assessment. Lydia captured Ethan's hand and pressed it to the spot where tiny limbs were asserting themselves against the confines of their first home. "Feel that," she said. "That's your child telling us to have faith." They spent the following weeks preparing for both possibilities, the normal arrival of their baby and the potential arrival of an unsympathetic official. Mrs. Henley coached Lydia in birthing techniques, while Samuel and Ethan baby-proofed the house and built a cradle that would have been suitable for royalty. The entire town seemed invested in the success of their family offering advice assistance, and the kind of moral support that made bureaucratic interference seem not just wrong, but impossible. It was Mrs. Patterson, the judge's wife, who provided the most practical assistance. A formidable woman with connections throughout the territorial government, she took it upon herself to research the inspector who might be coming and the legal standards that would govern any investigation. "Good news and bad news," she announced during one of her visits, settling her considerable bulk into the chair Ethan had built specifically to accommodate her comfort. Good news is that territorial law requires clear evidence of abuse or neglect before children can be removed from their parents. Bad news is that some inspectors interpret neglect pretty broadly when it comes to parents who don't fit their notion of normal. "What can we do?" Lydia asked. "Document everything. Show that this baby will have proper medical care, adequate nutrition, a safe environment, and parents who are devoted to its welfare. Show that you have community support, and that your own condition doesn't interfere with your ability to provide loving care." And if that's not enough, Mrs. Patterson's smile was fierce. "Then you'll discover that judges' wives have their own ways of influencing territorial policy. I've been writing letters to some very important people, and they're all very interested in ensuring that families aren't persecuted simply for being different." The inspector arrived on a Tuesday morning in early September, when the desert was painted with the gold light of changing seasons. Lydia had been feeling odd all morning, restless and uncomfortable in ways that went beyond her usual pregnancy discomforts. She was trying to focus on the delicate beadwork of a christening gown when the official knock came at their door. Inspector Harold Whitman was exactly what she'd feared, a thin, severe man in his 50s who carried himself with the rigid bearing of someone convinced of his own moral superiority. He surveyed their home with obvious disapproval, taking notes on a clipboard that seemed to serve as both shield and weapon. "Mrs. Cole," he said without warmth, "I'm here to assess the suitability of this household for child rearing. I'll need to examine your living conditions, interview you and your husband about your preparations for parenthood, and observe your daily routines." "Of course," Lydia replied, though her heart was racing with anxiety. "We're happy to cooperate with any official inquiry." Whitman's examination was thorough and intrusive. He measured rooms, counted windows, inspected their food supplies and financial records. He questioned their marriage, their business arrangements, and their plans for child care. Every answer seemed to generate more notes, more frowns, more obvious disapproval. "I understand you operate a sewing business from this location," he said, studying her workspace with skeptical eyes. "Yes, I'm a seamstress. I serve customers throughout the territory." And you believe you can manage both a business and an infant while dealing with your condition. The pause before the word condition was filled with judgment. Lydia felt her temper rise but forced herself to respond calmly. I believe a woman can be both a mother and a contributing member of her community, regardless of physical limitations. More notes. And what arrangements have you made for times when your condition might interfere with proper child care? My husband and brother are both here to assist as needed. We also have the support of our community and access to medical care through Dr. Mitchell. A traveling doctor who visits quarterly, Whitman said dismissively, hardly adequate for the needs of a high-risk situation. Before Lydia could respond, another pain hit her stronger than the restless discomfort she'd been feeling all morning, unmistakable in its intensity and purpose. She gripped the edge of her workbench, trying to breathe through the contraction while maintaining her composure in front of the inspector. Mrs. Cole, Whitman's tone shifted from disapproving to alarmed. Are you quite well? The baby, she managed. I think it's coming. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity that transformed their home from a place under investigation into a birthing chamber. Mrs. Henley arrived as if summoned by maternal instinct, taking charge with the competent authority of a woman who'd helped deliver half the babies in Copper Ridge. Samuel was dispatched to fetch Dr. Mitchell from his rounds, though everyone knew the baby wouldn't wait for official medical assistance. Through it all, Inspector Whitman remained ostensibly to complete his assessment, but obviously fascinated by the drama unfolding before him. He'd retreated to a corner of the main room, still taking notes, but now observing a family in crisis rather than conducting an official interview. Mrs. Cole, Mrs. Henley said during a brief lull between contractions, you're doing beautifully. The baby's eager to meet its parents. Is everything normal? Lydia gasped. Everything's exactly as it should be. Your body knows what to do, disability or no disability. The labor was long, but not complicated, and as afternoon faded into evening, Lydia found herself supported by Ethan's strong arms, while Mrs. Henley coached her through the final stages of bringing their child into the world. Push now, dear, the older woman instructed. Your baby's almost here. And then with a final tremendous effort that seemed to draw on strength she didn't know she possessed, Lydia felt her child slip from her body into the waiting world. The tiny cry that followed was the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard, a strong, healthy protest against the indignity of leaving its warm nest. A daughter, Mrs. Henley announced, wrapping the baby in soft blankets before placing her in Lydia's arms. A perfect, beautiful daughter. Lydia looked down at the tiny face, red and wrinkled, and absolutely miraculous, and felt her heart expand in ways she hadn't known were possible. This was her child created from love and determination and the refusal to accept that some people were too broken for happiness. She's so small, Ethan whispered, his voice thick with wonder. He traced one finger along the baby's cheek, and she turned toward the touch with instinctive trust. But strong, Mrs. Henley observed. Look at those lungs. Indeed, their daughter had found her voice and was using it to express her opinions about the bright, cold world she'd entered. The sound filled the room with life and joy and the unmistakable evidence that this family, whatever its unconventional aspects, had successfully brought forth new life. From his corner, Inspector Whitman cleared his throat awkwardly. Perhaps I should return at a more convenient time. Perhaps you should see what you came to assess, Ethan said firmly, though his attention remained focused on his wife and child. You wanted to know if we could provide proper care for a baby. Look around. Whitman looked around indeed, taking in the scene before him, a woman who'd just given birth being supported by a devoted husband, assisted by caring neighbors, celebrating the arrival of a healthy child in a home filled with love and purpose. Whatever he'd expected to find, whatever stories he'd been told about unfit parents and dangerous situations. The reality was undeniable. "The baby appears healthy," he said finally, his official tone not quite masking his own wonder at what he'd witnessed. "The baby is perfect," Lydia corrected, looking up from her daughter's face for the first time since the birth. "And she has parents who will love and protect and provide for her no matter what anyone else might think about our fitness." "Yes," Whitman said quietly. "I can see that." He stayed long enough to complete the official paperwork, declaring the household suitable for child-rearing, his earlier disapproval replaced by what might have been respect for the family he'd misjudged. As he prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Mrs. Cole," he said, "I came here expecting to find a situation that required intervention. Instead, I've witnessed something rather remarkable. I'll be recommending that no further investigation is necessary. And the complaints that brought you here will be filed as unfounded and motivated by personal animosity rather than legitimate concern." After he was gone, Samuel returned with Dr. Mitchell, who pronounced both mother and baby in excellent health despite the circumstances of the birth. The doctor stayed for supper, regaling them with stories of other frontier births while keeping a professional eye on his newest patients. "You've done something extraordinary here," he told Lydia as he prepared to leave. "Not just giving birth, though that was beautifully managed, but proving that families come in all different forms, and that love makes them work, regardless of what the world expects." That night, as Lydia lay with her sleeping daughter nestled against her chest and Ethan's arm around them both, she reflected on the improbable journey that had brought them to this moment. 2 years ago, she'd been dying alone in the desert, abandoned by everyone who should have protected her. Now she was surrounded by love, holding the tangible proof that her life had value beyond anything she'd dared imagine. "What should we name her?" Ethan whispered, careful not to disturb their daughter's peaceful slumber. "I've been thinking about that," Lydia replied. "What about Hope Sarah Cole?" The middle name was a tribute to the sister whose death had taught Ethan the value of protecting those society might discard. It seemed fitting that their daughter should carry that memory forward, a reminder that love could triumph over abandonment, that families could be built from choice rather than obligation. "Hope Sarah Cole," Ethan repeated. "It's perfect." In the morning, they would begin the work of raising their child, of teaching her that she was wanted and valued and part of something larger than herself. They would face the challenges that came with parenthood on the frontier, with bodies that didn't always cooperate and a world that didn't always understand. But tonight, they simply held their miracle and marveled at how far they'd traveled from that desert morning when death had seemed certain and love had seemed impossible. They'd built something beautiful from the ruins of their separate tragedies. A family that proved broken. People could create wholeness, that abandoned souls could find home, and that the most profound love sometimes emerged from the deepest wounds. Outside, the desert wind sang its ancient song of endurance and transformation. And inside their home, 3 generations of Coles, Ethan, Lydia, Samuel, and baby Hope, settled into sleep, surrounded by the quiet certainty that they'd found what everyone searches for. But few ever discover a place where they belonged. People who chose them freely and loved strong enough to weather any storm the world might send their way. The carpenter who'd stopped for a dying woman had gained a wife, a child, and a deeper understanding of what it meant to build something that would last. The abandoned daughter who'd expected to die alone had discovered that families could be chosen as well as born, that home was created by love rather than blood, and that some stories that begin in desert despair could end in desert joy. And in the years that would follow, their story would be told and retold throughout the territory, not as a tale of charity or obligation, but as proof that the most beautiful things in life often came disguised as the most broken, and that love, real love, had the power to transform everything it touched. 5 years had passed since Hope Sarah Cole took her first breath in that little adobe house on the edge of Copper Ridge, and the desert town had grown around the family like rings on a tree each year, adding layers of connection and community that strengthened the whole. The workshop that had once sheltered two broken souls now rang with the laughter of a child who knew no world but one where she was cherished, where her parents' love for each other and for her formed the bedrock of everything she understood about life. Hope was a curious child with her father's steady temperament and her mother's keen eye for beauty in unexpected places. She could often be found perched on a stool beside Lydia's workstation, her small fingers learning to guide needle through fabric while she chattered about everything and nothing in the way of children who feel absolutely secure in their place in the world. Her legs were strong and quick, carrying her through adventures that her mother watched with a mixture of joy and wistful amazement. "Mama, why can't you run with me?" Hope asked one afternoon, looking up from the wooden horse Samuel had carved for her 3rd birthday. It wasn't asked with cruelty or even curiosity about disability, but with the simple directness of a child trying to understand her world. "Because my legs work differently than yours," Lydia replied, setting aside the wedding dress she was altering for the banker's youngest daughter. "Some people's bodies are made for running, and some are made for other kinds of strength." "What kind of strength do you have?" "The kind that builds beautiful things, the kind that turns scraps of fabric into dresses that make people feel special. The kind that loved you before you were even born." Hope considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "Papa says you have the strongest heart in the territory." "Papa says a lot of things, but he means them all." From across the workshop, Ethan looked up from the rocking chair he was finishing for the new preacher's wife, his eyes warm with the quiet contentment that had settled over him like a comfortable coat in the years since their daughter's birth. The lines around those pale blue eyes had deepened, but they were laugh lines now carved by joy rather than sorrow. The business had grown beyond anything they'd imagined in those early days. Lydia's reputation as a seamstress had spread throughout the territory and beyond, bringing customers from as far away as Santa Fe, who wanted her distinctive style of embroidery and her eye for making simple fabrics look elegant. Ethan's furniture was equally sought after, his pieces becoming heirlooms that families passed down through generations. But more than their individual success, they'd become integral to the life of Copper Ridge in ways that transformed both them and the community. Lydia served on the committee that planned the annual Harvest Festival, her organizational skills and artistic vision making each year's celebration more memorable than the last. Ethan had been elected to the town council, his steady judgment and fair dealing making him a natural mediator when disputes arose. Samuel had married the previous spring, choosing a shy but warm-hearted woman named Ellen, whose own family had been touched by tragedy and who understood the value of chosen kinship over blood relations. They'd built a small house on the other side of town, but remained deeply connected to the Cole household, treating Hope as if she were their own niece and providing the extended family network that frontier life demanded in. It was Samuel who brought them the news that changed everything. One crisp morning in October, when Hope was helping her father sand a cabinet door and Lydia was putting finishing touches on a christening gown for the latest addition to the Henderson family. "Letter came through on yesterday's mail, Coach," he said, his expression carefully neutral in the way that suggested the contents were anything but routine. "Official territorial seal, addressed to both of you." Ethan accepted the envelope with steady hands, though Lydia noticed the slight tension in his shoulders as he broke the wax seal. They'd had no trouble with officialdom since Inspector Whitman's visit, but the memory of that scrutiny remained fresh enough to make any official correspondence a source of anxiety. "What is it?" she asked, watching his face as he read. "It's from the territorial governor's office," he said slowly, his voice carrying a note of wonder. "They want to honor us. Something called the Territorial Award for Community Service and Moral Leadership." "Honor us?" Lydia's voice came out higher than she'd intended. For what? Ethan continued reading, his eyebrows rising with each paragraph. For demonstrating the highest ideals of frontier life through our commitment to family community service and overcoming personal challenges to contribute meaningfully to territorial development. He looked up, meeting her stunned gaze. They want to present the award at the territorial capital during the New Year's celebration. That's wonderful, Samuel said, though his tone suggested some reservation. Isn't it? It's incredible, Lydia said, then paused. It's also terrifying. The thought of traveling to Santa Fe, of being honored in front of territorial officials and prominent citizens, filled her with the same anxiety she'd felt before Inspector Whitman's visit. What if she couldn't live up to whatever image they had of her? What if her disability became a spectacle rather than simply part of who she was? We don't have to accept, Ethan said quietly, reading the uncertainty in her expression. Awards are nice, but they're not why we do what we do. No, she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. No, we should go. If they want to honor what we've built here, what our family represents, then maybe it's important for other people to see that families like ours are possible. But that evening, as they sat around their kitchen table with Hope coloring pictures of horses and houses while they discussed the logistics of the trip, Lydia found herself thinking about representation in ways she never had before. For years, she'd simply focused on building a life that worked for her, on finding her place in their small community. But this award suggested that their story had traveled beyond Copper Ridge, that other people were drawing inspiration from their example. What if there are other women out there like I was? She said suddenly. Women who've been told they're too broken to have real lives, real families. What if seeing us receive this award helps them believe different things are possible? Then it's worth whatever discomfort the attention might bring, Ethan replied. If our story helps even one person refuse to accept other people's limitations on their dreams, then we owe it to them to tell it. The journey to Santa Fe took 3 days by stage, with overnight stops at way stations that tested both Lydia's physical endurance and Hope's patience with confinement. But the little girl proved to be a seasoned traveler, charming fellow passengers with her observations about the changing landscape and her complete lack of self-consciousness about her mother's need for assistance getting in and out of the coach. Santa Fe was a revelation, a city that seemed impossibly sophisticated after years in Copper Ridge, with buildings of 3 and 4 stories shops, filled with goods from around the world and streets busy with people from every walk of life. Their hotel was grander than anything they'd ever experienced, with carpets that felt like walking on clouds and windows that looked out over a plaza where musicians played and vendors sold food from dozens of different traditions. Is this what cities are like? Hope asked, pressing her nose against the window glass as they settled into their rooms. This is what some cities are like, Lydia replied. Each one is different, just like each person is different. I like our town better, Hope announced, with the absolute certainty of a 5-year-old. It's the right size for people to know each other. The award ceremony was held in the Territorial Capitol building, a massive structure of sandstone and timber that spoke of governmental authority and permanence. As they entered the main hall, Lydia felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that came with being observed by strangers, with being judged by people who knew her only by reputation. But then she saw the other honorees, a school teacher who'd educated 3 generations of children in a remote mountain settlement, a doctor who'd spent his career serving mining camps and ranch communities, a couple who'd run a way station that provided safety and supplies to travelers for over 20 years. These were people who'd simply done their work with dedication and integrity, who'd built something meaningful in places where building anything was difficult. Governor Samuel Crawford was a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and kind eyes who put them immediately at ease with his genuine interest in their story. As he spoke with them before the ceremony, Lydia realized that this wasn't political theater or empty recognition, but acknowledgement of something the territorial leadership genuinely valued. "Mrs. Cole," he said, "your story has traveled throughout the territory and beyond. There are newspapers in Denver and San Francisco that have written about the seamstress of Copper Ridge who built a thriving business and raised a family despite challenges that might have defeated others. You've become a symbol of what's possible when people refuse to accept limitations." "I never intended to be a symbol of anything," she replied honestly. "I just wanted to have a life worth living." And that's exactly why your story matters. You didn't set out to inspire others or make political statements. You simply lived your life with dignity and purpose, and that authenticity is what makes your example so powerful. The ceremony itself was both grander and more personal than she'd expected. As Governor Crawford read the citation that accompanied their award, Lydia heard her life story transformed into something that sounded almost mythic. The abandoned woman who built a business, the broken family that found healing, the love that overcame seemingly impossible obstacles. The Territorial Award for Community Service and Moral Leadership is presented to Ethan and Lydia Cole of Copper Ridge. The governor announced, in recognition of their demonstration, that strength comes in many forms, that families are built by choice as well as blood, and that the true measure of a life is not what challenges we face, but how we choose to face them. As they stood together on the stage, accepting the recognition of their peers and the applause of strangers who'd been moved by their story, Lydia felt a profound shift in her understanding of her own life. She'd spent so many years seeing herself as someone who'd overcome limitations, someone who'd managed to build something good despite her disadvantages. But standing there holding her daughter's hand, while her husband's arm encircled her shoulders, she realized that her story wasn't really about overcoming anything. It was about discovering that she had never been broken in the first place. The limitation hadn't been in her legs, or her circumstances, or her family's cruelty. The limitation had been in other people's ability to see past surface differences to the person underneath. What she and Ethan had built together wasn't a triumph over disability. It was a celebration of two complete people who'd found each other and created something beautiful. That evening at the reception following the ceremony, they were approached by a young woman who walked with the aid of crutches, her gait uneven, but her bearing proud. She was perhaps 25, well-dressed and confident, accompanied by a man who looked at her with obvious adoration. "Mrs. Cole," she said, her voice carrying the refined accent of Eastern education, "I wanted to thank you for what you've done, what you represent. I'm Margaret Thornton. I teach school here in Santa Fe. When I read about your story in the newspaper, it gave me the courage to accept my fiancé's proposal." "I don't understand," Lydia replied. "Why did you need courage for that?" "Because I was born with a club foot, and I'd convinced myself that no man would truly want a wife who was imperfect. I was afraid that any proposal would be motivated by pity rather than love." She looked at the man beside her, who squeezed her hand encouragingly. "But reading about you and your husband, seeing proof that real love exists between people regardless of physical differences, helped me understand that I was worth choosing for who I am, not despite who I am." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with other guests joining the discussion as they shared stories of how the Cole family's example had influenced their own lives and decisions. There was a businessman who'd hired his first disabled employee after hearing about Lydia's success, a doctor who'd begun treating physical differences as variations rather than defects, a preacher who'd changed the way he counseled families dealing with disability. "You've started something," Margaret Thornton said as the evening wound down. "A conversation about what makes a life valuable, what makes a family complete. It's bigger than you realize." Later, as they tucked Hope into her bed in their hotel room and sat together by the window, looking out over the lights of Santa Fe, Lydia and Ethan reflected on the day's events and their implications. Do you think it's true? Lydia asked. What that young woman said about us starting something. I think we've been part of something that was already starting, Ethan replied thoughtfully. The territory is changing growing up. People are beginning to understand that communities are stronger when they include everyone, when they find ways to use all the talents available instead of discarding people who don't fit narrow ideas of normal. And you're comfortable with that, with being examples. I'm comfortable with being honest about who we are and what we've built. If that helps other people, then it's a blessing. If it doesn't, we haven't lost anything by living our lives with integrity. The return journey to Copper Ridge gave them time to process the experience and plan for the changes that recognition might bring. Already the hotel desk clerk had mentioned receiving inquiries from people who wanted to visit their workshop to see the place where their story had unfolded. We'll need to think about how to handle that, Lydia mused as their stage rolled through the familiar landscape of home. People coming just to stare to satisfy curiosity about the famous crippled seamstress and her husband. Some will come for that, Ethan acknowledged. But others will come because they need to see that what we have is real, that it's possible. Those are the ones who matter. They returned to find Copper Ridge buzzing with news of their honor, the entire town taking ownership of their success as if they'd all played a part in making it possible, which Lydia realized they had. The community's acceptance and support had been essential to everything they'd accomplished, providing the foundation of belonging that made all their other achievements possible. Mrs. Henley had organized a celebration at the community hall, complete with a banner congratulating our award-winning family, and tables laden with food contributed by everyone in town. Sheriff Barnes made a speech about civic pride. Dr. Mitchell toasted their health and happiness, and even the normally taciturn blacksmith stood up to say how proud he was to live in the same town as people who'd shown the world what frontier values really meant. But it was Hope who provided the moment that would stay with Lydia forever. When called upon to say something about her parents' award, the 5-year-old climbed onto a chair and looked out over the gathered crowd with the solemn attention she brought to all important occasions. My mama and papa got a prize for being good people, she announced. But I already knew they were the best people because they're mine, and now everyone else knows it too. The simplicity of that statement, the absolute certainty in her young voice that she was loved and valued and part of something special, represented everything Lydia had hoped to achieve when she'd first imagined having a family. This child would grow up never doubting her worth, never accepting that physical differences meant personal limitations, never believing that love was something she had to earn rather than something she deserved. In the months that followed, their lives settled into a new rhythm that accommodated their unexpected fame while preserving the essential character that had earned them recognition in the first place. Visitors did come, some mere curiosity seekers, but many genuine pilgrims seeking proof that the limitations they'd accepted for themselves weren't actually permanent. They welcomed them all with the same hospitality they'd always shown, answering questions honestly and sharing their story without embellishment or false modesty. Some visitors left disappointed that the reality was less dramatic than the newspaper accounts had suggested. Others left with renewed hope and determination to build lives that reflected their actual desires, rather than other people's expectations. One visitor stood out among all the rest, a middle-aged woman who arrived on the evening stage one day in late spring, traveling alone and carrying herself with the careful dignity of someone who'd learned to navigate the world without expecting kindness. She introduced herself as Mrs. Rebecca Hamilton and said she'd come from Colorado specifically to meet them. I have a daughter, she said simply, sitting in their parlor with a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. She's 16, born with spina bifida. She's intelligent, talented, capable of so many things. But she's convinced herself that she'll never have a real life. She's heard about you read the newspaper stories, but she refuses to believe that your situation is comparable to hers. What does she think makes it different? Lydia asked gently. She thinks you must be less disabled than you appear, or that your husband must be somehow defective himself to choose you, or that the whole story is exaggerated for inspirational purposes. Mrs. Hamilton's voice carried the exhaustion of a parent who'd watched her child diminish herself for years. She's planning to enter a religious institution to spend her life in service since she's convinced she can't have a family of her own. And you disagree with that plan? I disagree with her reasons for it. If she chooses religious life because it calls to her, that's wonderful. But if she chooses it because she thinks it's all she's worthy of, then it's a tragedy. They talked long into the evening, sharing strategies for helping young people see past society's limitations to their own possibilities. It wasn't the first such conversation they'd had, and it wouldn't be the last. Their story had somehow become a beacon for families struggling with disability, offering both hope and practical examples of how to build fulfilling lives. "Would you be willing to write to her?" Mrs. Hamilton asked as she prepared to leave the next morning. "Would you share your story directly, woman to woman? I think hearing from you personally might carry more weight than newspaper accounts." Lydia agreed, and over the following months, she began a correspondence with young Sarah Hamilton that gradually expanded into letters with dozens of other young women and their families. What started as personal encouragement evolved into something approaching a ministry, though she never thought of it in those terms. The letters that arrived at their Copper Ridge address came from across the American West and beyond, from parents seeking guidance, from young people looking for proof that their dreams weren't impossible, from medical professionals trying to better serve their disabled patients, from community leaders working to create more inclusive societies. Each letter received a personal response, written in Lydia's careful hand during the quiet evening hours when Hope was asleep and Ethan worked on his more intricate carving projects. She shared practical advice about adapting daily tasks, emotional support for dealing with prejudice and self-doubt, and always the fundamental message that had transformed her own life. You are valuable exactly as you are, worthy of love and respect and the chance to pursue your dreams. You've become a teacher, Ethan observed one evening, watching her respond to a particularly moving letter from a young man whose family had thrown him out after he'd lost his legs in a mining accident. "I've become someone who remembers what it felt like to believe I was worthless," she replied, pausing in her writing to look across the room at him. "If sharing our story helps even one person reject that lie, then it's the most important work I've ever done." As Hope grew older and began asking more sophisticated questions about her parents' fame and the visitors who came seeking their wisdom, Lydia found herself thinking about legacy in ways she never had before. What would their daughter learn from all this attention, from growing up in a household that had somehow become a symbol of possibility? "Do you ever worry that we're too different from other families?" she asked Ethan one night as they walked through their garden, following the paths he'd built so she could tend the vegetables and flowers that had become another source of joy in their life. Different how? All this attention, the letters, the visitors, the responsibility of being examples. Most children grow up in families that focus entirely inward on their own needs and challenges. Hope is growing up understanding that our story belongs to more than just us. Is that a bad thing? Lydia considered the question seriously, watching Hope chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, while Samuel and Ellen sat on the porch discussing plans for their own hoped-for children. Their little girl was a confident, compassionate, completely secure in her place in the world, but also naturally generous with others. She regularly helped in the workshop, treating customers with the courtesy and interest she'd learned from her parents. She was growing up understanding that everyone had value, that differences were natural, rather than threatening, that families came in many forms, and that love was the essential ingredient in all of them. "No," Lydia said finally. "I don't think it's a bad thing at all. I think it's teaching her that her life matters not just to us, but to the larger world. That what she does with her gifts will ripple outward in ways she may never fully understand." And that's a lesson worth learning. That's a lesson worth living. As they walked back toward their house, Hope running ahead to tell her uncle about the fireflies she'd caught and released, Lydia reflected on the improbable journey that had brought them to this moment. 7 years ago, she'd been dying in the desert, convinced that her life had no value beyond the burden it placed on others. Tonight, she was walking through a garden she'd planted in a place she'd helped build, surrounded by people who loved her, not despite her limitations, but including them as part of who she was. The awards and recognition were gratifying, but they weren't what mattered. What mattered was Hope's laughter echoing across their yard, Ethan's hand in hers as they walked the familiar paths of home, Samuel's quiet presence that had healed old wounds none of them had fully acknowledged. What mattered was the letters from strangers who'd found courage in their example, the visitors who'd left carrying new possibilities back to their own communities, the gradual expansion of what the world considered normal and valuable. They'd built something that would outlast them, not just their business or their family, but a way of understanding human worth that challenged the casual cruelties their own early lives had taught them to accept. In a small desert town that most maps didn't bother to include, 2 broken people had discovered they weren't broken at all. And in that discovery, they'd helped illuminate possibilities that reached far beyond the boundaries of Copper Ridge. The carpenter who'd stopped for a dying woman had built more than furniture or even a family. He'd helped build a world where stopping for dying women was seen as the natural choice, where choosing love over conventional wisdom was celebrated rather than questioned, where the measure of a life was what it contributed rather than what it lacked. And the abandoned daughter who'd expected to die alone had become someone whose very existence challenged every assumption about worth and weakness that had shaped her early years. In learning to value herself, she'd taught others to see value in the people their communities had overlooked or dismissed. Their story had become larger than themselves, but it remained rooted in the simple truth that had saved them both. Love has the power to transform everything it touches, turning waste places into gardens, broken people into whole families, and small acts of kindness into legacies that echo across generations. Under the vast desert sky that had witnessed both their near destruction and their ultimate triumph, the Cole family settled into another evening of their remarkable ordinary life, secure in the knowledge that they'd found what they'd been searching for, without even knowing they were searching a place where they belonged completely. People who chose them freely and loved strong enough to change the world one heart at a time.